And now I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Madam President, the Russian delegation welcomes the holding of today's discussion. We're grateful to our Polish colleagues for this initiative. We're also grateful to today's keynote speakers, Madam Viotti, Mr. Ovadu, and Mr. Miron for their presentations. The topic of today's meeting is no doubt important and timely. It refers us back to the origins of the United Nations and the League of Nations, their ancestors, and the basis they created for international relations that have been concentrated and focused today in the charter of the global organization. In the preamble of the charter, it proclaims that the nations of the United Nations are determined to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from the treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. Furthermore, the main principles and norms of international relations are enshrined in the Charter, starting from sovereign equality of states and the prohibition to interfere in their internal affairs, including the ban on the use of force in international relations without the authorization of the Security Council or outside of self-defense. Madam President, Russia has always considered that international legality is the main attribute of a stable world and of security. Even back in 1899, Emperor Nicholas II initiated the first Hague Conference, which started codifying not only the rules for conducting war, but also the procedures of a peaceful resolution of international conflicts. Another milestone were the Nuremberg Principles, and our country made a significant contribution in formulating those principles. These and other rules were designed to rid the world from the heavy legacy of the Second World War and the errors of the past. The UN Charter and the international law that was developed on that basis are a sound foundation for intergovernmental relations. So everything seems to be quite straightforward. Live and let live, and help those who request assistance. However, as was rightly noted by the Polish presidency in the conceptual note to today's meeting, in spite of that, in many parts of the world, violations of international law continue. To that, I would like to add that it's not only certain norms and rules that are violated, but rather the basic founding principles of international law that are being violated. The principles of good faith and cooperation among states are increasingly replaced by the practice of military, sanction-based or political pressure, taking the world back to the pre-UN Charter period when all disputes among states were resolved by the use of force. Some states continue to consider that the whole world must live based on their templates, their internal legislation and customs, and in accordance with their national interests. The ideas of exceptionalism and domination existed and continue to exist and the basis of their approach to international affairs. Feckless and opportunistic attempts to impose their will on other participants of intergovernmental relations do not stop for a second. It seems that these states continue to adhere to colonial approaches and divide countries into two categories: those who have all the rights and those to which the standards of law do not apply. Now, the outcome of all this is the use of blackmail, threats, and provocations as government policy, going as far as the use of force against sovereign states. And in fact, our partners from Equatorial Guinea mentioned this kind of blackmail today, and we share their concerns. Such things are inadmissible. These kinds of practices do serious damage to global and regional stability. They lead to the spread of extremist and terrorist ideology. All this maintains the situation in the world in a state of permanent tension and makes the situation increasingly less predictable. Madam President, now, the analysis of recent events in Syria is quite illustrative of this trend. First of all, let's ask ourselves the following question. What was and what continues to be the basis for the military presence of the United States and the coalition led by them in Syria? The legitimate authorities of the country, as is well known, did not invite them because they, with the help of allied friendly states, are effectively combating terrorism. At the initial phase, the members of the coalition awkwardly referred to self-defending themselves from terrorism. Now their presence is justified by the uninvited guests, increasingly by so-called aims of geopolitical stabilization. What about international law? Well, for these kinds of cases, the West has already developed this kind of formula that is called illegal but legitimate. The culmination of this kind of international legal nihilism was the aggression against Syria on the 14th of April of 2018. It's not enough that the pretext was staged beforehand and is a gross fabrication. Even if we theoretically imagine that an imaginary country A was guilty of some kind of violation, everyone knows that military reprisals are banned under international law. The use of military force against a state, I'd like to recall, is only acceptable with the authorization of the Security Council or in self-defense. This is clearly enshrined in the UN Charter. Paragraph 4 of Article 2 and Article 51 are some of the best known and widely quoted provisions. Today, we will circulate as a document of the Security Council a statement by our President on this issue dated on the 14th of April of 2018. It's no surprise in this situation that we're not even seeing any particular attempts by the United States, Great Britain, or France to justify somehow their actions of the 14th of April. Their illegality from the point of view of international law is so obvious that in the capitals of these countries they probably see everything, they understand everything themselves. Quite obviously, that is what the President of Poland mentioned today when he suggested that we should not be afraid to call acts of aggression by their name, to call a spade a spade. That is precisely what I am doing. The only state that tried to provide some explanation was the government of the United Kingdom. London didn't manage to invent anything better than to refer to the concept of humanitarian intervention as the need to prevent the suffering of the people of Syria. However, it's well known that the international community rejected this notion even as an abstract theory. To try to present it as some sort of a rule which gives London the right to conduct a military attack against the sovereign state makes even less sense. So what is the result of all this? 3 permanent members of the Security Council, founding members of the United Nations, nuclear powers, which in theory are duty-bound to strictly defend the provisions of the Charter on the non-use of force, carried out an aggression against the sovereign state. And here in the Council, and many in fact joined in justifying the action. Isn't it clear that if we leave such actions without response, tomorrow similar illegal actions could be conducted against those who today remain silent? In such conditions, and given this kind of behavior by external actors, the UN and its Security Council have to work on a political settlement in the Middle East and Syria in particular. It's surprising in this situation that these same players are managed to lecture states on the rules for behavior in international relations. They have long ago lost the right the moral right to teach others. The internal crisis in the Ukraine is another consequence of the gross violation of external players, by external players of international law, but this time the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states. It's commonly known that the conflict that led to an anti-constitutional coup and the war of the Kiev regime against its own people was encouraged from outside. The result is overall chaos and anarchy, the destruction of the economy, an orgy of nationalism and extremism that threatens even the neighbors of Ukraine. Meanwhile, everyone prefers to look away in embarrassment. For example, our Polish president today, speaking of the Ukraine, preferred not to mention the fact that today Kiev glorifies those who fighting in alliance with Hitler, participated in the killings of hundreds of thousands of Poles, Jews, Russians during World War II. I mean, isn't what's happening is that by quietly acquiescing to the propaganda of the worst kind of crimes, you're also undoing the decisions of the Nuremberg trials. If due to political or other considerations, if you prefer not to notice this, then we are not bound by such restrictions. Of course, it's much easier to blame everything on Russia rather than convincing Kiev to engage in dialogue with with its own citizens who live in the eastern part of the Ukraine. And we do not intend to sit and listen to lectures about the Crimea. It's joining the Russian Federation is fully in line with international law, and in particular the right to self-determination. This is a matter that is closed. Anticipating a statement by the Ukrainian delegation, which I have no doubt will not offer anything new, I will say in advance that we will not react to these insinuations. Madam President, I also have to touch upon another topic that has direct relationship to the work of the diplomatic corps that is accredited to the United Nations. The conviction of its own impunity recently has led the authorities of the United States to unilateral actions that have basically rewritten the rules of diplomatic and consular relations. What's on the agenda now is also the abuse by the authorities of the United States of the rights and privileges of hosting the headquarters of our global organization. In essence, what's at stake is the open use of sanctions against delegations of this organization. The recent mass expulsion of Russian diplomats, including those working in the UN, is an egregious example. But unfortunately, it's not the only one. There is talk of seizing Russian property on the territory of the United States, including parts of the official premises of the permanent mission of Russia at the United Nations, imposing a 25-mile zone of restriction on the free movement of diplomats of a number of missions, various delays in issuing or extending visas. These gross violations by Washington of the Convention on Diplomatic and Consular Relations of the UN Headquarters Agreement have become a daily occurrence. This is a serious problem that is weighing on the whole organization and each one of its members. I want to underscore that this is not an issue of our bilateral relations with the United States. This is a violation of international law. Madam President, Russia has consistently considered that it's essential to uphold the primacy of law at the international level. In 2016, together with China, we developed a joint declaration on enhancing the role of international law. In addition to the principles of non-interference, the sovereign equality of states, the non-use of force, the inadmissibility of unilateral measures, the extraterritorial application by states of their national legislation in breach of international law, particular attention is focused on the principle of peaceful resolution of disputes. The declaration confirms our strict adherence to this principle and our conviction that states are duty-bound to resolve their disputes with the help of the means and mechanisms of dispute resolution that have been agreed among them. To maintain international law and order, it's essential for all these mechanisms and means to be used in good faith and that their purposes are not undermined by abuse. Madam President, in conclusion, I want to underscore that we are determined to strengthen cooperation with all responsible participants of the international order in upholding and enhancing the role of international law and establishing a just and equitable order based on international law. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation